stream, and then we'll jump right into things. Okay, so a little bit more about myself, especially my relationship with sacred mushrooms, which we're going to learn a lot about tonight. I was exposed at a very young age, and I wasn't aware of them as being anything sacred. I grew up in foster care and was like kind of your typical like disaffected youth. And so I, sought them out because I thought like, oh yeah, this is going to get me high, like help me like forget about my problems, all that kind of stuff. But as time went on and as I became an adult, I started to learn more about the history of these mushrooms, how sacred they are to different people around the world. And I wanted to kind of really learn more about these. So I went on this journey maybe about 3 or 4 years ago before COVID, just kind of learning about the history of how these sacred mushrooms have been used. And so that's what I'm going to share with you tonight. This is part 2 of a talk that I do. So in the part 1, we went more through a different period of time. We took a trip kind of all over the world and explored where we learned about early polytheistic tribes and civilizations, including early Christians who used mushrooms and plants in their religious practices, and how sacred mushrooms were used in different rituals and traditions to commune and find harmony with the planet. And it was reflected in their artifacts and their religious texts. And so now we're going to dive into the period that I call the war on nature, which really, it's been called this war on drugs, right? And so we're going to learn how this war on nature is a tool used by the ruling class to maintain power and control. And we'll observe different art and artifacts created by polytheistic religions as they were replaced with monotheistic ones. And I'm going to start explaining how alchemy was introduced to Europe and how monotheistic religions took shape, leading to the Crusades and Western colonialism. We'll continue into the 60s and 70s when the so-called US war on drugs was codified and spread around the world, and then into the 21st century. And we'll look at how mushrooms are used in contemporary art, movies, video games, and more. And we'll see how the sort of spiritual was replaced with material, and the collective consciousness was replaced with rugged individualism, and art as a commodity kind of grew out of this paradigm. And so we'll see how sacred mushrooms were portrayed subversively as a rebellion against the ruling class. So in order to understand the so-called war on drugs, we'll have to learn about how drugs or medicine came to be what they are today. So some of you may know that the precursor to chemistry or medicine was called alchemy. And so alchemy existed in ancient Greece, North Africa, Asia, the Middle East, long before it arrived to Europe during the medieval period. And each country had different names and techniques, but what they had in common was their direct relationship with the plant and all of the plant and mushroom allies. And they used this through the art of healing. And in Egypt, alchemy was a great art gifted by their god Thoth, the god of language, math, and science. The Greeks further declared him the inventor of astronomy, astrology, the science of numbers, mathematics, geometry, surveying, medicine, botany, theology, civilized government, the alphabet, reading, writing, and oratory. They further claimed that he was the true author of every work of every branch of knowledge. So he was like the dude, this guy. So when the Roman Alexander the Great conquered Egypt, he gained access to all of these artifacts from this region of the world and secrets, things that were kept sacred. And so this included the famous emerald texts and 42 hermetic scrolls that were created some 38,000 years ago. And they were found in an ancient Phoenician, or they were written in an ancient Phoenician language. They were found in a tomb in Heliopolis, and he decided that he wanted to place these scrolls and these sacred archives and put them on public display. And so construction of the city of Alexandria, the famous library to house these hermetic texts, was began immediately, and he had assembled a panel of priests and scholars to prepare translations into Latin. And so I kind of think of him as like the open source kind of bro of his time. It's like tablets for everybody. And so the ancient emerald tablets and the hermetic scrolls were said to include the secrets of the universe and included alchemy, astrology, philosophy, geography, medicine, theology, even musical texts. And the tablets were known to contain the philosopher's stone, also called the elixir of life, which was useful for rejuvenation, of achieving immortality. Hermetic philosophy teaches that all things come from one thing, the prima materia, which is a web of being and spirit. And as time went on, the emerald texts were translated into Latin. The philosopher's stone was interpreted as a formula that could transmute any base metal into gold. And this eventually was the most sought after goal of alchemy when it reached Europe. And so Hermes is considered to be a combination of the Greek god Hermes and the Egyptian god Thoth. And he was purported as the author of the Hermetica. And so here you see some floor mosaics and a replica of an engraving that shows the alchemical symbols of sun, moon, and fire. And so European alchemy was a mixture of science, philosophy, and mysticism. And the art was filled with a lot of esoteric symbolism and the prominence that it gave to the idea of influencing or controlling nature rather than being integrated with nature. It led many scientists to look to the magics and its allied arts, such as astrology, which is thought could put nature to the test by the means of doing experiments. And there was no formal kind of scientific method at this time, so there were many diverging texts, and some alchemists and their apprentices they died doing experiments with the different elixirs, trying to create gold. And so in both plant and animal, Middle Ages sought to find the secrets of creation or life from elixirs of mushrooms, minerals, plants, and even animals in their experimentations. And there were many books on alchemy published at the time, including this one by the German named Faust, which compares the power of chemical science to a double-edged sword, powerful but dangerous in the wrong hands. And so this is where we kind of get this idea of the Faustian bargain. And so he's famous in history for selling his soul to the dark side, which is known, as I mentioned, the Faustian bargain, which is a pact when a person trades something of supreme moral or spiritual importance, such as a personal value or the soul, for some worldly material benefit, such as a knowledge, power, or riches. So choosing between this binary of good and evil that was really being established during this time. And so it really took part and started to be adopted in some early Christian religions as well, and began to gain dominance. And so now alchemy is most widely accepted as a precursor to modern chemistry, and many of the processes from this time is still used. And so the center symbol you see here, the caduceus, I think I'm saying that right, or the staff of Hermes is the modern symbol for medicine. And so you can kind of see how this is derived from some of this very early religious art and symbols in early art, which we covered in the first part. And so as the Crusades in Europe continued, this sort of obsession for a quest for gold, good and evil, the expulsion of demons was starting to be found all over art. So there only are a few examples that actually include mushrooms, and this one's kind of hard to see because it was largely ignored. And so these are some anonymous engravings from the 1600s called The Expulsion of Demons. And it's a real classic example of alchemical initiation, of having demons kind of baked out of one's head. And the demons represent these kind of billowing clouds, which contain universal elements of like an expanding consciousness. And so seen here, you can see there might be like a couple mushrooms. It's like some people theorize this, that there's mushrooms in this one. But there's a ton of these kind of pieces of art at this time. And so in this illustration from the Book of Lamb Spring, we see a man intoxicated on Amanita muscaria, or the fly agaric mushroom. And he clutches one mushroom in his hand, and he dances about holding his other hand to his forehead, as if the revelations are too intense. And behind him, the tree grows with a spotted mushroom on the top. And so to the right, you see the 12th century fresco from a church in France of Adam and Eve at the mushroom tree of life. And so this motif was very common at that time. So Arabic translations were eventually translated into Latin of the Emerald text around the Middle Ages, and a translation by Sir Isaac Newton is found among his alchemical papers that are housed at Cambridge. And these translations and knowledge being brought from Northern Africa and the Arab world brought Europe out of the Dark Ages into what is called the Age of Discovery. So this enlightenment that seemed, some of us may have learned it as like something spontaneous, like it was really just all of this like ancient knowledge being brought in from other parts of the world and translated into Latin. So Carl Jung, the famous psychologist that spent a lot of time trying to understand the subconscious, identified the emerald tablets with a table made of green stone, which he encountered in the first of a set of his dreams and visions. He described them in his writings, The Seven Sermons to the Dead. He also famously said, for the alchemist, the one primarily in need of redemption is not man, but the deity who is lost in sleeping in matter. God is in everything, is what he was trying to say. Jung interpreted the emerald tablets as something that was achieved through a higher consciousness, not something material, as a formula for turning base metals into gold. He believed these writings pronounced a universal knowledge and a story of our connection to the one being which is expressed in all beings. Something that does not gel with monotheistic religions that are now dominant in our culture. So ethnobotanist and consciousness guru Terence McKenna agrees, calling the tablets a formula for a holographic matrix that is mirrored in the human mind that offers mankind its only hope for human survival. The ancients clearly possessed a genuine science of consciousness, which is really an understanding of dark matter. The ancients compared this to the veil of ignorance, which must be pierced to allow light of consciousness to shine through. And in Vedic or Indian alchemy, which is called Veda, this could not be achieved through materialism. And so to this day, it's a great mystery to where the emerald tablets and the alchemical texts are hidden, or the contents of the Philosopher's Stone. And like Jung and Terence McKenna, some believe it is immaterial, The tablets were supposedly buried during the time the scholars were in prisons, and libraries, including the Alexandria, were burned down by religious zealots during the Roman conquest. And so since there wasn't any formal scientific process or peer review, the practice led to a lot of division. Alchemy became associated with the so-called occult, was considered heresy and banned by the Catholic Church. Galileo was even convicted of heresy for resurrecting the old Greek Copernicus theory that the earth revolved around the sun. And since Christianity and Judaism are paternal religions that came into power after overcoming maternal religions, the Catholic Church thought of Galileo's heliocentrism as a revival of a maternal religion because it implied that Mother Earth moves by itself and makes the sun, the symbol of Father God, would fall. And so the English crown, also fearing the potential devaluation of gold, should the philosopher's stone actually be discovered, made penalties for alchemy very severe. And as you can see, this was clearly about consolidation of power, and so alchemy was forced underground. And so we all know about Joan of Arc being burned at the stake in witch trials that were held all over Europe and also in the US. Some scholars believe that some of these so-called witches were hallucinating from ergot, which is a fungus that grows on wet rye. And ergot contains lysergic acid, which is a precursor to the synthesis of LSD. And so nearly all of the accusers lived in the western section of the Salem village, a region which is swampy, a swampy meadow that would breed this kind of smut fungus, which was most likely consumed in their beer. And so psychotropic mushrooms and herbs were used in beer, or what is known as gruit ales, until 1516, when the German government and the Holy Roman Empire implemented the Bavarian purity laws, or Reinheitsgebot. This required that barley, hops, which are a sedative, and water only be used in beer. And so this stamp here was issued in 1983, commemorating the 450th anniversary of the purity laws. They were strictly enforced in many parts of Europe. And before the purity order, one ingredient used in beer was psychedelic mushrooms. The fly agaric mushroom, which is widely used in pagan rituals throughout Europe, offers a natural, easily accessible way to transcendental mystical awakening. Not only that, but magic mushrooms literally expanded the human mind and can increase a person's cognitive power, neither of which helped the Catholic Church maintain its control over Europe. And in 1986, the purity laws were finally banned. And so over the past several years, there have been an explosion of beers of all types of edible mushrooms and other ingredients. And so tonight you can get cordyceps in your drink. Our local in Austin, there's a brewery called Jester King, and they just came out with a cordyceps beer as well, that mushrooms that are grown from one of the farms. And so while there are no beers on the market with psychoactive plants and mushrooms, if we get past this sort of war on nature, it might be possible with legalization. And so when I first did this talk like 3 years ago, there were only 363 mushroom beers on the wall on this app. And now there are 582 when I checked it the other day, which is exciting. And so from the conquest of Northern Africa also came early star maps. And the oldest accurately dated star map appears in ancient Egyptian astronomy in 1534 BC. And so this device called the astrolabe, an early instrument that was handheld model of the universe, was introduced to Europe. So Europeans began traveling further distances across seas and oceans, and they created a version that was for maritime travel. So the monarchies and Catholic Church controlled who had access to these maps and sea routes. and Western colonization began, and Europeans began to prosper off the resources and labor of people in other parts of the world. Colonization in the New World began. And as we learned in part one, magic mushrooms, also known as flesh of the gods, or in the ancient Aztec language, Tionanaquetl, have been used for centuries by many indigenous people around the world. And in pre-Columbian time, before the Spanish arrived, frescoes found in one of the pyramids depicted a paradise, a mountain of abundance. And so these fungi appeared in Aztec statues like the one on the right depicting Xochipilli. And so I cover a lot of this information in part one that you can watch online. And so when the Spanish conquistadors arrived to Mesoamerica in 1519, they believed the mushrooms used in sacred rituals allowed the Aztecs to communicate with devils. This made it easy to justify the death of many people that were killed and tortured by disease and during the Inquisition. Here is a 17th century painting of the fall of the Aztec Empire, likely painted by a Spanish conquistador. So now going back to Europe, before photographs, Facebook identification groups, and DNA sequencing, botanical illustrations, songs, poetry, and folk wisdom is how people learned how to identify mushrooms. And if you were royalty, you had your own botanical illustrator. Claude Aubry was a French illustrator and botanical artist to King Louis the Great. His mushroom paintings dated from 1730, and Aubry created nearly 800 drawings in return for little recognition of his art and artistry. And a select portion of these illustrations can now be seen, and it's published by the University of Chicago Press. So we see a couple of different species. Hericium, that's lion's mane. Different species of lion's mane, but if you haven't tried the jerky, you should try it. And so here are two illustrations from an 1800s field guide that incorrectly identified the death cap, or the Amanita phalloides, as Amanita mappa, which contains almost no toxins. And so to the right, you see a poem written by someone around this time by Meg Beagle. In the 17th and 18th centuries, several historical figures died from eating death caps by accident or by assassination. And here are some of the famous figures that died during this period. And shortly after Charles VI's death from a meal of mushrooms, the War of Austrian Succession broke out, and many of the borders changed in this part of the world. So the famous French philosopher Voltaire was quoted as saying, "A dish of mushrooms changed the destiny of Europe." And these famous deaths in Europe led to an intense culture of mycophobia in Western Europe. The fear of accidentally poisoning appeared to have cast doubt over the nutritional and medicinal value of mushrooms. The language used around mushroom was often very viscerally and hostile, drawing upon images of filth and waste. Several writers referred to them as excrements of the earth, or a bundle of putrefaction arising of a cold, moist, viscous matter of earth. The Victorian world still expressed deep ambivalence about fungi, even though children's fairy stories are populated with innocent versions of the fly agaric, toadstools, and pixies dancing in fairy rings. And so you can see them here in this famous painting by Walter Jinks Morgan. And the particular genre deals with the underworld of fairies and elves and European superstitions, routinely warned against entering a fairy ring. If you dare to enter the ring, Many myths warned you will die young. You'll also become invisible to the mortal world, unable to escape the ring, or you're transported instantly into the fairy realm. And every culture and every kind of border had different myths and superstitions. And so this spooky fairy ring painting by George, he was an illustrator for the first English translation of the Grimm's fairy tale. I really like this one. So this romantic genre associated with romantic literature of the time, and it provided a very sense of escapism. And many artists painted scenes from the popular Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream. And so Disney even got into the fairy game in the 40s with the Fantasia film. And so at the time, it was considered a masterpiece in animation and composition. And it featured dancing hippos and fairies and mushrooms and a segment set to Tchaikovsky's Nutcracker Suite. And the animators said they found inspiration looking at the movements of mushrooms from the Three Stooges, which is kind of funny. But yeah, I'm gonna try to play a little bit of this. I'm just worried the sound might blast everybody. I don't know, do you guys want to hear it, see it? Okay, I'm just worried about sound. I didn't do a sound check, so maybe cover your ears at first. Yeah, let me see if I can do that. Let's see. Okay, let's see. Okay, I don't think it's actually recording the sound. So you can only hear it on my laptop. Cute. Three Stooges movements, apparently. So now modern science can explain fairy rings. The mycelium of fungus growing in ground absorbs nutrients by the secretion of enzymes from the tips, or what is called the hyphae. And so this breaks down larger molecules in the soil into, and then absorbs through the walls of the hyphae near their growing tips, sort of like an external stomach, same sort of way. And the mycelium will continue to move outward from the center. And when they need more mushrooms to grow, they will fruit mushrooms if conditions are right and continue to grow outward. There are some fairy rings that have been found to be over a mile wide. And so this is a photo of one that I found in Austin, like on July 4th. I was wearing my red, white, and blue dress. And notice I'm not in the fairy ring, I'm on the outside, so I'm still superstitious. So around this same period of art, Alice in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll was written. It included the famous illustration of mushroom larger than humans. And much debate over the type of magical mushroom has gone on over the centuries. And it is now known that John Tenniel, the book's illustrator, did not have a scientific background, but his inspiration from drawing in the magazine Punch of the Pope as a caterpillar. And so to the right is a photo from the Tim Burton Alice in Wonderland movie where you see the mushroom as an Amanita muscaria or a fly agaric mushroom. And so it is now documented that a few days before writing Alice in Wonderland, Carroll, the author, made his only ever visit to the Bodleian Library, where a copy of Mordecai Cook's recently published drug survey called The Seven Sisters of Sleep, which was published in 1860s, had been deposited. And the copy of the book was missing the chapter on the fly agaric, or the Amanita muscaria. Carroll was particularly interested in all things Russian. In fact, Russia was the only country he had ever visited outside of Britain. And we learned in the last talk about how ancient cultures from this region of the world, Siberia and Scandinavia, consumed Amanita muscaria, and it made them feel very big and like flying. So I think that mystery of what the mushroom is now solved. And so criminalization of and use of substances from Mordecai Cook's book continued through the Victorian period. Mycophobia and misunderstanding of mushrooms really didn't change until the French introduced mushrooms in hot cuisine. And this was imported into the US during early colonial periods. So mushrooms were only used as a condiment, and they were used to make what we call ketchup. And it was purported that it was a favorite of Jane Austen's. So Geo Watkins is a popular mushroom ketchup, also known on Instagram as a Victorian umami. And it's still a favorite in the UK and was featured in the Downton Abbey cookbook. And it can be still bought online today. And yeah, I don't have any with me, but it's kind of more like Worcestershire, however you say it. I know that's a tough one. And so tomatoes weren't used in ketchup until the 1830s, when of course it was sold as a popular medicine, bringing it back around to the alchemy and drug theme. And so in 1834, Dr. John Cook Bennett claimed his recipe could cure diarrhea, indigestion, scurvy, jaundice, rheumatism. And due to all these false claims, the ketchup medicine empire collapsed. Shortly thereafter, the Heinz filled in the spot with less bogus claims. And so as America's interest in mushrooms grew, entire cookbooks were devoted to them. One of the first English language mushroom cookbooks was Kate Sargent's 100 Mushroom Receipts. And if you want a PDF of this, I have it. Sargent's work included some of the very fabulous Harry Potter sounding recipes, including Coprinus comatus soup, which is shaggy mane soup, Lepiota procaria stew, baked tricholoma personatum. So yeah, lots of fun recipes to look at. And Receipts was the name they used for recipes at the time. So if you tell people you have receipts, better have some recipes. So in the book's introduction, Sargent described the changing of American attitudes towards mushroom at the turn of the century. The general opinion in this country regarding mushrooms has been that, with one or two exceptions, all form of fungus growth are either poisonous or unwholesome. But it was very gratifying to observe the change that is rapidly taking place in the public mind. And so the science of mycology was developing, and devoted amateurs were out in the field and the woods collecting, but popular antipathy and misunderstanding of fungi still mostly dominated the sentiment. And so fungi was either classified as an animal or a plant, and amateur mycologists at the time also did their own scientific illustrations, like these from 1850 from French scientific illustrator Adolphe Malot. You can still buy these posters online. So children's author and illustrator Beatrix Potter of Peter Rabbit fame was also a close observer of the many details of nature, focused perhaps less notably on the secret world of fungi and lichens. At the time when women had no right to vote and virtually had no access to higher education, very rarely owned property and were themselves considered property of their husbands, Potter became a commercially successful writer and artist, using the royalties from her books to purchase her famous hilltop farm. So Ernst Haeckel was a famous German biologist who described and named thousands of new species, mapped a genealogical tree relating all life forms, and coined many terms in biology. This was around the time when the microscope was invented, and his interpretations are very surreal and allowed for even more abstract details that had never been seen before. Anybody recognize any of these? And so this brings me to the next period of art, Surrealism. And so during this period, art started to react to the ruling class that brought on World War I. In revolt against a society ruled by rational thought, the Surrealists tapped into the superior reality of the subconscious, painting unnerving, illogical scenes, many times mixing the real with the surreal. And so here's a few abstract or surreal artists that I thought drew some or painted some really fungal type shapes. So Toyen, born Maria Sermanova, was a key member of the Czechoslovakian Surrealist movement. Born female, he referred to himself in the masculine gender, which is why he is named Toyen, which can be parsed in Czech as she's he. And to the left, Toyen depicts a cluster of fungi, oysters perhaps, emerging from the cracks in a wall near a sketched outline of a fox whose foot is dangling a blue bird at the wall's base. So in the second painting to the right, you can see a very realistic painting of morels with surreal floating hands in a tissue. So this is kind of how I felt the last few years because we didn't have any morels in Texas. And so this surrealist movement was male dominated and is often regarded as sexist because it began to attract many women and became much more gender balanced as time went on. Although many surrealists were forced underground during the Nazi occupation and the Second World War. So many artists worked as illustrators, and here's an example from a Soviet children's magazine called Merzilka from 1924. The illustration shows anthropomorphized fly agaric mushrooms with text that translates, we are coming, we'll exterminate the entire bourgeoisie. So if you want to buy this shirt, you can buy it online at sovietvisuals.com. So mushrooms were disturbingly used as a metaphor in anti-Semitic propaganda. So Der Giftpilz, The Poisonous Mushroom, is a children's book published by Julius Streicher in 1938. And so the title alludes to how just as difficult it is to tell a poisonous mushroom from an edible mushroom, it's difficult to tell a Jew apart from a Gentile. And so this anti-Semitic book wants to warn German children about the dangers supposedly posed. So during World War II, many African Americans were segregated, fighting on the front lines. The US states still enforced apartheid, also known as separate but equal at home and in the military. And it was widely known that the Nazis learned how to divide and conquer from studying US slavery and Jim Crow laws, which still existed beyond World War II. So I like this Langston Hughes quote. So after Japan had already agreed to surrender, the US committed the ultimate act of war on nature by dropping the atomic bomb that created a mushroom cloud over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The US military wanted to set a precedent in fighting the next ideological enemy. Here's an illustration by atomic bomb survivors that are a chilling reminder of this crime against humanity. The matsutake mushroom is a highly prized edible mushroom that can fetch extravagant prices in Japan, sometimes as high as $10,000 per kilometer. Known for its spicy aroma and taste, some compare it to cinnamon. Mycologist David Aurora describes it as a blend of red hots and old gym socks. They are found in the Pacific Northwest and on the verge of extinction in Japan as the pine forests that they rely on are being destroyed. But mushrooms are resilient curiosity of nature and sometimes thriving in environments disturbed by humans. And in Anna Singh's The Mushroom at the End of the World, she shared that after the atomic bombing of Hiroshima, the first thing to grow was the matsutake mushroom. And so here you see a tarot card from an artist from the Pacific Northwest, Joe Buckley, and he lets us know about the matsutake, and it reminds us that for every action, there is a reaction. Being mindful of your choices and compassionate towards the choices of others. Fungi was portrayed as a foreign resource in a planet populated with little green people in distress in the children's science fiction novel, Wonderful Flight to a Mushroom Planet, written by Eleanor Cameron in 1954. The book was so popular that it even had a follow-up called Stowaway to a Mushroom Planet. Eleanor was known for publicly speaking out against Oompa Loompas from Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, which were originally portrayed as abused African slaves. And the pictures and descriptions of the Oompa Loompas were revised in the 1973 edition. And so Eleanor was not far off with her sci-fi ideas that there are planets ruled by mushrooms. 420 million years ago, a giant feasted on the dead, growing slowly into the largest living things on land. And this fungus is called Prototaxides. You can see a fossil here. There's a really great PBS Eon show about this particular fungus. And so this atomic age of visual arts included lots of fear-based themes and phobias. Matango is a 1963 Japanese horror film directed by Ishiro Honda, and it was nearly banned due to scenes that depicted characters resembling victims of the atomic bombings. And it is about a group of castaways on an island who unwittingly altered by a local species of mutant fungus, or mushrooms. Okay. Not sure what's happening. Okay, we're back. Okay, well, you can watch that on YouTube. Maybe that was a dead link. So like I said, I did this like talk 3 years ago. I didn't check all the links. So before the 60s, sacred or psychedelic mushrooms use were not understood or common in the US. There were a few key events in popular culture that made psychedelic mushrooms ubiquitous in art and use. In 1957, Life magazine did a cover story called Seeking the Magic Mushroom, which is a photo essay by amateur mycologist J.P. Morgan and publicist Robert Gordon Wasson. Oh. Let me check this too. Um, Time for a break. Bathroom break. Intermission. We got about 40 more slides to go. What was that? Oh, good. Yeah, good time for a bio break. What was that? Should I try replugging in? We just do my display settings again.
So what's going on with it? Was it when you just like blew up there? Was it still showing on your screen?
Yeah. Yeah, no worries.
Real.
Hey, we're back. I'm actually good. I'm all full, so. It really is. Like, I'm actually kind of surprised, like how strong that mycelium is. Yeah. Mhm. Okay. All right, we'll start in another minute. Says we back. Yeah. What? With what? Oh. All right, is everybody ready? We'll jump back into the 60s. So before the 60s, sacred or psychedelic mushrooms were not understood or common in the US. There were a few key elements and events in popular culture that made psychedelic mushrooms ubiquitous in art and in use. So in 1957, Life magazine did a cover story, Seeking the Magic Mushroom, which is a photo essay by amateur mycologist and J.P. Morgan publicist Robert Gordon Wasson, describing his experience taking psilocybin mushrooms in 1955 during a Mazatec ritual with Maria Sabina in Oaxaca, Mexico. Wasson was one of the first Westerners to participate in this ritual. Robert and his wife were fascinated by the differences in cultural attitudes towards fungi in Russia. The couple both began their field research learning about mushroom use in Siberia. And so this is what got the State Department, US State Department, interested in him. And so recently, through a FOIA request by John Marks, a writer, it was discovered that Robert Gordon Wasson took a trip was funded by the CIA's MK Ultra project, and Wasson was an unwitting participant. And so during the Cold War, there was a lot of resources thrown at finding ways to weaponize nature. The CIA were looking for finding chemicals that would be able to control people's minds, get information from people, destroy or control people's minds in order to smear and delegitimize them. And we still don't know the extent of this program because many documents were destroyed. And some of the findings of this MK Ultra program are now dramatized in TV shows and documentaries, including the first season of the popular Netflix show Stranger Things. Another show on Netflix is called Wormwood. And so One Step Beyond was a documentary style TV show that was on ABC. And in 1961, the episode The Sacred Mushroom deals with the discovery of the mind-altering drug that was purportedly able to increase a user's psychic powers. Newland, the TV host, traveled to Mexico where he met with a local practitioner or shaman. And this reality style TV episode was very controversial and banned for a very long time from syndication. Although now you can watch it on YouTube. And I'm not going to watch it. It's kind of boring, to be honest. And so after these major media events and with additional help from people like Alan Watts, Timothy Leary, the Beatniks, mushrooms and other psychedelics became ubiquitous and were found on everything from yarn art, cookie jars, pot holders, blacklight posters. And in his memoir, author Tom Robbins talks about the impact of the Life magazine article on turning on Americans to psychedelic mushrooms, including himself. The Life magazine article sparked intense interest in the Mazatec ritual practice among beatniks and hippies, and interests that proved to be disastrous for the Mazatec community and for Maria Sabina, shown on a mural here. And as the community was besieged by Westerners wanting to experience their mushroom-induced hallucinations, Sabina attracted attention by the Mexican police, who thought she was trying to sell drugs to foreigners. The unwanted attention completely altered the social dynamic of the Mazatec community. And the community blamed Sabina, and she was ostracized in her community and had her house even burned down. And so Sabina regretted having introduced Wasson to this practice, even though it's noted that it was very coercive in nature, the way that this all went down. But Wasson, of course, contended that his only intention was to contribute to the sum of human knowledge. So mushrooms' popularity in art and use happened during the Vietnam War, and a lot of new classified evidence shows the, shows the Hold on.